Now we need to talk about the other side of the market, aggregate supply. So what do we want to understand when we look at aggregate supply? Well, first of all, what is the aggregate supply curve? Aggregate supply curve is the curve that shows the relationship between the level of prices and the quantity of output supplied. Now, it seems pretty straightforward. We're going to have an aggregate supply curve just like we have an aggregate demand curve. The difficulty comes in the fact that we have two time horizons that we want to look at. One is the long run, and we know in the long run all prices are flexible and move to get us to equilibrium, and we produce output equal to potential output. In the short run, we have relatively fixed prices, or sticky prices. So it turns out we're going to have two different aggregate supply curves. One is the long-run aggregate supply curve. The other is the short-run aggregate supply curve. The long-run aggregate supply curve is the aggregate supply curve that exists in the long run when prices are flexible and output equals potential output. What we're going to see is it's a vertical curve. It represents that the idea that in the long run output is determined solely by factors of production. Because remember, we have in the long run output is some function of capital and labor. That's the production function. Nowhere in here do we have prices. So it depends on the state of technology, how much capital, and how much labor is being used. That's how much output we produce in the long run. We call that potential output. So when we look at the long run aggregate supply curve, it's vertical, straight up and down. Output equals potential output. No matter what the price level is, output equals potential output. It's independent of the price level. What does that mean for when we use aggregate supply and aggregate demand? Well, let's look at the effect of a change in aggregate demand. So suppose something happens that shifts the aggregate demand to the right. We would go from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. And we see that prices would rise, but nothing happens to output. So the effect of this change in aggregate demand in the long run is a rise in prices and no change in output, because output equals potential output. Unless something affects long-run aggregate supply, and so affects potential output, output's going to stay there. And the impact of a change in aggregate demand will be completely on the price level. The other aggregate supply curve is the short-run aggregate supply curve. As we saw that for some period of time, prices might remain sticky or relatively fixed. In these instances, output is determined by demand. And so our aggregate supply curve is relatively flat. Represents the idea that prices do not change very much in the short run, and firms adjust production to meet demand. Now when we look at an aggregate supply curve, it's going to be relatively flat like this. So prices don't change very much with this aggregate supply curve, and output does. Here we see that a change in aggregate demand, the same one we saw earlier when we looked at long-run aggregate supply, the impact of the change in aggregate demand is now mostly on output. So a shift of aggregate demand to the right in the short run increases output and may have a small increase on the price level. So what we see is, in the long run, changes in aggregate demand principally affect prices. In the short run, changes in aggregate demand principally affect output. This is what gives macroeconomics and questions about macroeconomic policy such rich answers, because we might have differing answers whether they're talking about a short time horizon or a long time horizon. You want to get relatively comfortable with this difference between the long run and the short run, because it's going to have a large impact on how we answer significant questions as we move forward.